Hey H&K fans, James here with another video for you. A couple of weeks ago I released a video review on the HK P7 series, and if you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, clear your afternoon calendar and go to the YouTube channel and give it a look. I think you'll find it very thorough. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well James, after creating a 3-hour video review on a series of pistols, you probably couldn't have anything else to really talk about relating to them. But of course you'd be wrong. In fact, when it came time to edit everything and finally put that together, there was quite a bit of information that was left on the cutting room floor just simply because of how massive that video was in itself. So what I'm going to do today is delve into a little bit of history into one interesting side story relating to the P7 series. So if you're a fan of those weapons or just the history of H&K as it relates to law enforcement contracts, stick around. This might be interesting for you as well. So what I'm going to cover today is the process, the protest, and the procurement of the HK P7M8 by the New Jersey State Police. Now there are obviously lots of other law enforcement organizations that were to adopt P7 series pistols, but the New Jersey State Police is really the most well known, and they also had the weapon really for the longest period of time in service, which as we'll see is really kind of uncommon for law enforcement agencies as far as adopting pistols and then repeatedly changing to another one over the years. Now I've been privileged to have quite a bit of information in my hands when I do these videos through my own reference materials and things that have been passed on to me. And one of the main documents that I'm going to use for this video is this right here. It's entitled The Justification for the Purchase of Heckler and Koch P7M8 by the New Jersey State Police, and as you'll see, it's rather massive. And then I've gotten a lot of other connections and friendships over the years, really because of the business that I'm involved in, and it's always a pleasure to be able to have an HK P7M8 come in for service and find out that it's from a former New Jersey State Police trooper, and those guys are always excited to share information relevant to the service of that weapon because they enjoyed it so much. That's pretty exciting for me. This report specifically was created in April of 1983 by a committee of troopers that collectively represented over 190 years of service with that agency. And they were tasked with selecting a new weapon for their police service. Now I'm going to refer back to some notes here as I go on the video just because I want to make sure I get the accuracy of some of the finer points of this. So I apologize if I'm looking away from the camera at some points in this. Okay, so the impetus of this adoption, as it usually is with agencies, comes from some kind of failure from the previous weapon system and a decision that it's time to move on and get something that's newer and better, and hopefully will prevent a situation like that from happening again in the future. And this is no different. What happened here with the New Jersey State Police was in December of 1981, a trooper, Philip LaMonaco, was killed during a routine vehicle stop where in the aftermath of the incident, the investigation, what they found was Trooper LaMonaco with an empty revolver by his side, and he had been shot 8 times by a 9mm semi-automatic pistol that had actually been fired 13 times. So that incident was kind of a wake-up call for them, as well as a lot of other agencies at that time in the early 80s that were realizing that more and more often the criminals that they were encountering were armed with newer style weapons, semi-automatic handguns, that the greatest advantage was the fact that they held more ammunition and they could be reloaded faster than what we saw traditionally law enforcement officers at the time carrying, which were still 38 and .357 revolvers. So I think what they realized was that no longer was the 6 rounds of a wheel gun considered sufficient to incapacitate that threat, especially when that threat could fire faster and reload faster than they could. So the challenge of the study for this committee was in providing an equal superior firepower to what they currently had, necessary to counter that threat while still maintaining the high degree of reliability that we expect out of a revolver. They didn't want to sacrifice that. And again, for those of you who aren't familiar with those earlier days, getting a reliable semi-automatic handgun was not as easy as we may have come to be comfortable with today. Additional criteria that were added to the committee's list was speed of deployment, safety, maintainability, and ease of training. And with their research into the semi-automatic pistols that were available, the committee benefited from 2 major studies or recent procurement programs that existed. One of those was the West German police trials in 1976, and the other one was the U.S. military's joint Service Small Arms Program, or JSAP, in 1981, which was to find a suitable replacement for the 1911 45 pistol. Now, if you've seen my P7 series video, you've obviously had me reference both of those in the development of the P7 series pistols. So you can go back and get some more information about both of those if you're looking for it there. But having those at access was really helpful for them to be able to base their own study on. This relating to the 45, initially they did consider the 45 caliber cartridge as one of the ones to select as well, but that was soon discarded, mainly because they felt that the greater recoil that was imparted into a weapon that was chambered in that cartridge served no benefit really over the lighter recoiling 9mm cartridges that they could carry more of capacity in or have a smaller size pistol. So they removed 45 caliber and instead focused on 9mm. So they initially arrived at this hypothesis. The semi-automatic 9mm handgun should be the primary armament for police officers in light of increasing potential for officers to use their handgun to counter escalating confrontations with armed criminals. The 9mm automatic, because of its increased firepower and reloading capability, is therefore far superior to the traditional revolver counterpart. So that really kind of set the stage for what they were looking for. They had quickly made the decision that they were only going to focus on 9mm semi-automatic handguns. And that allowed them to establish a methodology for the testing process. So the first part of that methodology was they wanted to make sure they had a true cross-sampling across all their divisions, meaning not just picking the best shooters, but getting newer and older officers with different experience levels to be able to be a part of this, so they could really get a true effect of how these weapons would be initially received, and any kind of problems that they'd find that would only really be found out by some newer shooters otherwise. But then later in the testing, when it came to specific things that they needed to have expertise in, like accuracy testing, they'd use key individuals like their division shooting team to help make sure that that was done as perfectly as possible. The next methodology they did was in selecting a new service cartridge. Obviously, if you're transitioning from a revolver that's shooting 38s and .357s, and now you're going to 9mm, not only do you need to pick a weapon, but you need to be able to pick the ammunition that you're going to choose as well. So they wanted to test two different types of ammunition of similar weight and velocity. And the way they wanted to do that was basically to fire each one of the test sequences twice, one with one caliber and then, one with one type of the 9mm ammunition and one with the other. And then the last one, as far as methodology, was the testing of the weapons themselves, that they would be scored on the previously mentioned criteria of functional and mechanical reliability, accuracy, safety, handling, speed of development, speed of deployment, maintainability, and firepower. So, to start these trials, they went out and looked at basically everything that was available within the firearms industry in a 9mm semi-automatic at that time, and those and looked at their specific requirements, and they laid these out as a way to basically weed out the ones that didn't meet those criteria. And those initial requirements consisted of that if it was hammer fired, they wanted it to be capable of decocking without actuating the trigger to drop the hammer. That was obviously focused on safety. They wanted to be capable of safely carrying a live round in the chamber, which again, we kind of seem odd these days, but back in the older days, it was common practice that a pistol would have a loaded magazine in it, but the chamber would be empty, and in order to, for safety reasons, and in order to bring it into action, the weapon had to be drawn from the holster, the slide manually cycled to chamber round, and then be able to be shot. And they weren't interested in that. They wanted the weapon to be brought into action as quickly as possible. So that brings you to the third one, being able to be drawn and fired immediately and accurately using either right or left-handed shooters without inconvenience. They wanted to be functionally reliable with a system of operation that allowed for consistent and reliable extraction of those cartridges. And again, that's one of the main challenges with pistols at this time, and still a challenge for developers for semi-automatic pistols, is that extraction and ejection process. A lot of weapons have failed because the extractor design just wasn't strong enough. They wanted it to be ready for instantaneous use without the added step of defeating a manual safety. They wanted a highly visible sighting arrangement. They wanted simple maintainability. They wanted an ambidextrous safety, magazine release, and slide release. They wanted the slide to remain open after the last round being fired, and they wanted it to be suitable for both on and off duty use, because what they were coming from were two different revolvers. One larger revolver in .357 for their duty use, and then a smaller revolver in .38, and they wanted to be able to just go to one weapon for ease of training and maintainability. So, if you're familiar with those two previously mentioned trials, the West German police trials and the JSAP program, you're going to see that the criteria that I just listed is very, very similar to what they saw in those. They took great reference to that. When the testing began, the following weapons were introduced for the trials. The first one was the Walther P5. The second one was the SIG P220, which for most people today, we think of the P220 as the full-size single-stack 45, but at this time, the 220 was actually a 9mm single-stack full-size pistol. The third one was the Sig Sauer P225, which is the compact single-stack version of that pistol. Then we had the Astra A80, and Smith & Wesson submitted 4 different pistols. They're 439, 459, 539, and 559. Then H&K showed up with a full complement, providing the VP70Z. Then the HK P9S, the HK P7, and then from the prototype model that was submitted to the JSAP trials, the P7A13, which is the predecessor to what we now know as the P7M13. And then the last 2 pistols that were included in the trials were the Ruger Security 6 revolver in .357 and the Ruger Security 6 revolver in .38. And these two weapons were used not really for adoption studies, because that's not what they were after, but to be the control measure in the test, so that they could really see a focus of reliable operation in each one of these sequence of tests versus the semi-automatics. Notably absent from the trials was the Beretta 92 SB, which at the time was involved in the JSAP and was kind of an up-and-coming popular semi-automatic pistol. But the committee viewed the exposed and unprotected trigger bar on the right side of the receiver as being a possible safety-related issue, because if enough pressure was applied to it, it could cause the weapon to accidentally discharge. So they omitted that from introduction to the test. For ammunition, the ballistic unit chose two different 9mm cartridges, 115 grain Remington jacketed hollow point, and the Winchester 150 grain silver tip ammunition. The final decision on which ammunition they would choose would be on the mechanical and accuracy tests that they would involve these weapons and ammunition through. The first phase of the testing focused on the mechanical function and handling of the weapon, with the accuracy potential kind of as a side note. So what they did was pull those selected members from across the divisions in, and they asked them to give them the personal views on what they thought about the operating principles and handling considerations, ease of employment, sighting of each one of those pistols. They had range personnel on hand that could record any malfunctions that occurred, and if they had any significant problems, they made sure that they took photos of those that they could go back and review later. For testing, in this first phase, they decided to use their current off-duty revolver Corsafire for its simplicity and focus on handling and reliability. And this consisted of firing 50 rounds at yard lines of 7, 15, and 25 yards. Each participant would shoot the course of fire, and then they would have their target scored, and they would have their comments recorded. And then they would move on to the next pistol in the sequence, and they would fire that course of fire again, same process, go down the line, next weapon. And from a mechanical standpoint, in this initial test, two weapons experienced significant enough malfunctions that they were immediately eliminated. The first one was the Walther P5, which had several failures to fire and failures to eject. And the second one was the VP70Z, due to a variety of malfunctions that the report doesn't specifically address. In all, though, in this initial phase, there wasn't one single semi-automatic pistol that completed the entire test, which consisted of 1,100 rounds being fired without cleaning, without some sort of mechanical problem. The only weapons that performed completely through this were obviously the two revolvers that they used as the control weapons. Many of the problems, though, were listed as user error with the cross-sampling of personnel, and that ranged from limp wristing when firing the pistol to not properly seating the magazine. Once that phase of the testing was complete, the committee reviewed the results, and what they found was that though the P9S ranked first in handling and third in accuracy, it was eliminated from continuing on in the trials because it failed to meet the requirement of being able to be safely decocked from double action to single action. From single action to double action without actuating the trigger. And if you can go out and watch my P9S or P9 series review, you'll see great detail about how the operating system of that works. But though it was a safe way to decock the weapon as far as the internal mechanisms in the pistol, the fact that you actually had to actuate the trigger, that was viewed as unsafe for obvious reasons that would never be something that you'd see on a design these days. So that weapon was removed, and what you had left for the second phase of testing were the following weapons. We had the SIG P220, which again was a 9mm single stack full-size pistol, the A80 from Astra, the Smith & Wesson 539 and 559, and then the P7, which actually ranked highest in all the categories, including the fewest malfunctions, second only obviously to the revolvers. And then the H&K P7M8. The two revolvers as control measures continued as well. So they had made a significant cut right there, just moving into the second phase. Now, with that second phase, they focused more on the accuracy, potential, and sustained firepower of the pistols. And in order to do that, that's where they brought in their specialized members to continue, and that was the New Jersey State Police Combat Pistol Team. For this phase of testing, they went through 2 10-shot strings of fire in order to evaluate each weapon on each of the 2 types of ammunition. They used a standard NRA style 25-yard slow fire target, using the weapons in single fire mode with 2 hands and a 6 o'clock hold on the target. And following each string of fire, the targets were removed and the results were recorded. And it was found that the Remington ammunition fired an average of 5.8 inches, whereas the Winchester ammunition fired an average of 7.1. From this, the finalist weapons that would move on were listed in performance order, and that was the H&K P7, followed by the P7M8, then the 6 Sauer P220, the Smith & Wesson 559, the 539, and then the Astra A80. For reliability portion of this testing, only the 6 Sauer P220 and the HK P7 were able to perform flawlessly. The concluding test for this trial focused on the sustained firepower with shooters engaging Army E-bobber style targets at distances of 15 and 25 yards under set time frames. Initially 5 seconds, then 10, then 30, and 60. And what the officers were to do was to engage each one of those targets with 2 rounds, transitioning to the next target, and then going back and forth, firing as many times as they could in the time allotted. The shooters would start with the holstered weapon with the safety off and the hammer down. Okay. When the committee weighed all the results of all the testing and evaluations related to the trials, they unanimously agreed that the H&K P7 was the only weapon that met or exceeded their needs for the criteria of firepower, reliability, accuracy, ease of training, safety, speed of deployment, and maintainability. They did have 2 areas that they requested be improved, and the first one of those was the placement of the magazine release. On the P7, it was that Euro-style heel mag release, and they instead wanted it to be mounted higher up on the grip area near the trigger. And the second was the necessity of a special tool for complete disassembly of the weapon for normal maintenance. And again, as you guys know, the P7 has a flush fit firing pin bushing at the rear, which requires a special tool that came with each one of the P7s in order to remove that out and maintain that area of the weapon. But those 2 requests were very simple for H&K to adhere to because they had actually already been implemented with the P7M8 prototype, which they had included in that trial. And so it was easy for them to make that modification. So in short order, they returned with what we now know as the P7M8. And that's the weapon that was chosen by the New Jersey State Police. And as you can see here in this comparison photo with the P7M8 on the left and the P7 on the right, the main noticeable difference, besides what I just mentioned, is the larger and deeper trigger guard that allows the weapon to be more easily shot with gloved hands, but the introduction inside that trigger guard of a polymer heat shield. And obviously the intent there of the polymer heat shield, as well as the polymer trigger that replaced the original steel triggers, was to help dissipate some of that heat that's coming off of the gas cylinder, gas piston area that's right above the trigger. In an all-steel gun, you want to be able to dissipate that as much as possible. So those two things were added to the P7M8. A myriad of other factors were involved in the New Jersey State Police adopting the P7M8, in addition to the fact that it demonstrated a high degree of reliability and unsurpassed by all the other semi-automatic pistols that they had. But those were, the primary ones were the incorporation of a retarded blowback design, utilizing the fixed barrel, which related to the weapon having decreased recoil, enhanced accuracy, and provided the positive extraction and ejection without the need of a robust extractor that we saw problems with in all the other pistol designs being tested. The second was the multifunction use of the cocking lever, which served as a safety device. It allowed the weapon to be cocked or decocked, and it also released the slide, all in an ambidextrous nature. In the manner that the shooter would have, he was able to basically manipulate the weapon completely, only using one hand, allowing him to free up his other hand for whatever other task he may be able to do. And because of the intuitiveness of just gripping the pistol, allowed him to keep his eyes on the threat instead of having to focus on the pistol, which again was seen as a big benefit. And then the last one was the striker-fired system in combination with that cocking lever system, which provided a consistent single-action trigger all the way through the firing, instead of all the other weapons where you started out with a heavy double-action trigger pull and then transitioned to that lighter single-action pull. That was seen as an area where most of the shooters had trouble keeping their accuracy, and it could be mitigated. But it took a lot of training in order to get to that point, and that's not something that most law enforcement agencies really have the time or money to put into. Also seen as a great advantage to selecting the P7M8 was its compact size. It was now going to be able to serve well as both a duty weapon and an off-duty capacity, and that obviously was a great benefit to them, again, from a training standpoint and from a standpoint of not having to maintain different types of ammunition and different types of magazines and SL3 components and all the other things that come along with those. So a proposal was quickly drafted and sent to H&K that included the procurement of the weapons with their magazines, as well as the holsters and magazine pouches that went with it, the leather goods. And that was kind of unusual at the time. Usually what you would see was contracts going out to individual companies that specialized in those focus areas. But for the New Jersey State Police, they were so motivated to get these weapons into use that they didn't want to have any kind of delay working with multiple different companies that would end up producing a weapon without the ability to actually put it into service because you don't have the other components necessary. So they put together this 10-page proposal and they submitted it to H&K for the weapons, and then specifically had H&K go out to Tex Shoemaker and Sons to create the holsters and mag pouches. Here you'll see several photos of the duty holster, which you can see they designed to be mounted to the Sam Brown belt that the troopers wore on duty. And then here with the magazine pouch, although it appears to be a double magazine pouch at first glance, it's actually a quad magazine pouch with two different compartments staggered with magazines front to back on both sides of the compartment. And that gave each trooper a total of 40 rounds of capacity, or 41 if they max it out with an additional round in the chamber. And here you see photos of the off-duty holster that was used for the pistol as well. The pistols and the leather goods were expected to be delivered in a quantity of 500 within the first 60 days, and then an additional 500 every month after that until a total of 2,500 were delivered. Now, I believe that in the end they actually got another 500 that brought them all the way up to a total 3,000 into service. But as you can expect, as often occurs with government, state, federal type contracts, there are always companies that are not happy with the results of those contracts, and what they will do is launch a formal protest on their behalf. And this wasn't any different. So 3 of the notable companies that were involved in this were Colt Firearms, Smith & Wesson Firearms, and then 2 specific leather manufacturers. The leather manufacturers made a grievance that the proposal was not an open bid, so they never had the ability to actually submit for it and provide a chance to be involved. But as I previously discussed, the state police quickly batted that down, saying that they knew exactly what they wanted, and they didn't want to waste any time putting that out, so they went with that sole source bid. The subject of the Colt and Smith & Wesson grievances is a little more complex. And we'll start with Colt. I think Colt's main complaint was the fact that they had been erroneously and unjustifiably precluded from even competing in the trials. And the response from the state police was the fact that if you had a double action semi-automatic pistol, then you would have been involved, but you don't have one, so that's why we didn't invite you into the program. And the second one was because they had ruled out 45 as a caliber. They were using 9mm, so they didn't have any rule for that. Of course, Colt went back saying, hey, there's lots of organizations that use our 1911, the military's been using it for all these years, all those kind of things. And of course, state police went back and said, okay, again, when you look at the criteria that we had for the weapons that were involved, one of the main focuses was the fact that we wanted to make sure you could safely decock the weapon without actuating the trigger. Colt didn't have that. And then there was the ambidextrous nature of safety and slide release and magazine release. Colt didn't have that. So there were a lot of features that weren't really working out for him. Of course, Colt countered back and said, hey, the P7M8 that you selected, it's not a double action pistol. And the state responded back saying that its unique cocking lever action was considered double action like, in the fact that what they were really looking for was that second strike capability. And if you're familiar with that, that's basically meaning that if you went to fire the weapon the first time, and for whatever reason, light primer strike, defective primer, whatever that is, that round didn't fire, you would be able to pull the trigger a second time and be able to fire that again without having to manually cycle the weapon. Well, with the P7, gripping the cocking lever is what pulls the striker back. If you pull the trigger, it doesn't fire. Just releasing the cocking lever and gripping it again allows you to pull the trigger all in one-handed motion. Whereas with the 1911 style from Colt, if you had a round that failed to fire, you would then have to use your support hand to either rack the slide, ejecting that round, putting the next one in to then fire again, or you'd have to manually use your support hand to cock the weapon back to fire again. And again, that violated the criteria that they were looking for. The next protest came from Smith & Wesson. And again, they had submitted 4 different models, the 439, 459, 539, and 559. Notably absent from the trials, though, was their 469, which was a slightly modified version of the 459 that they had introduced into the JSAP program. But there were several reasons why the state police rebutted that. The first of all was they recorded multiple issues they had with failures to extract and eject that were all related to a weak extractor design with those pistols. And it obviously affected the reliability and safe action of the weapon. So that was a death blow to the company. The second was the double action, single action transition that I referred to before. They didn't see that as good a system as what the HK P7 had of a consistent single action pull all the way through. And then third, Smith & Wesson lacked all those ambidextrous features we talked about before. In the response, though, they were very detailed in how they provided that information back to Smith & Wesson. And what they actually did was they looked at every single category that the weapons were tested on in the trials, and they had two columns, one for the P7 and one for the Smith & Wesson models. And what it showed was that in every single category, except for price, the P7 won out. So they were able to block that out. So in the end, what you were left with was H&K receiving the award for contract in 1983, with those weapons starting to be delivered in that late summer. As you can see here from this cover of the issue of Marksman magazine, the first year production for those pistols, the New Jersey police received a slightly different looking model than what we saw with all the following ones. So if you look closely here at the picture, what you'll see is the model designation on the front left side of the slide, where it says P7M8. That script is, and that location is different than all the preceding models. And that denotes it as a 1983 production pistol. So that's how those things will kind of stand out. Okay, so now even though this wraps up the protest portion relating directly to the New Jersey State Police adoption of P7M8, this is a great time to segue into a similar situation that was seen with another law enforcement adoption of a P7 series pistol. And I thought it was kind of interesting. I want to share with you guys. Now I've got these copies of 3 separate letters that I found in the back of a binder that I inherited from a well-known H&K employee from the golden years, and it's kind of cool. So I'll share this with you as well. I'm going to keep the names out of it just to protect those individuals, but here we go. So the first one is, it's dated 11 September 1986, and it's from the Senior Vice President of Marketing with Smith & Wesson, and it's addressed to the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of Utah. And it reads, Dear Commissioner, we have been informed that the Utah Highway Patrol intends to purchase approximately 400 Heckler and Koch P7M8 semi-automatic pistols. It is our understanding that a purchase order has been issued on a sole source basis, thus avoiding the normal competitive bidding procedure used by the state of Utah. Smith & Wesson requests that your review as quickly as possible this purchase with a view to the reasons that a competitive procedure were avoided, and also the decision making that was used in choosing the H&K gun. We believe that you will wish to become familiar with the record that this gun has generated with the New Jersey State Police since May of 1983. As you can imagine, the facts surrounding New Jersey's experience are somewhat vague. Suffice it to say, we are aware of approximately 11 instances where New Jersey troopers suffered self-inflicted wounds, and accidental discharges are too numerous to count. The most recent incident involved a lieutenant who shot himself in the hand while instructing recruits in the use of the gun. A far more tragic instance involved the Capitol Police of Washington, D.C. This unfortunate incident left an officer dead as a result of a tactical exercise involving loaded guns. Nonetheless, the truly unique cocking system used in the H&K gun was indicated as the cause following the incident, and the Capitol Police Special Tactical Unit replaced its H&Ks following this incident. It is obvious, of course, that neither of these departments is anxious to share fully this information. However, the details may be checked with any number of independent training organizations, notably the NRA Training Unit in Washington, D.C. The decision to purchase the P7 begins with this recommendation of your firearms instructor. This highly experienced individual is personally comfortable with the P7, which he carries off duty. The difficulty with this choice, however, is the inappropriateness of the P7 in the hands of the average street officer or trooper. The record in New Jersey amply supports this point of view. To compound the problems with this purchase, the P7 is more expensive than other acceptable alternatives, including the Smith & Wesson Model 469. However, knowing that in a competitive situation, his gun of choice would be underbid, your firearms instructor was also recommended a sole source procurement technique. For these reasons, Smith & Wesson asks for you to review the purchase and open this procurement to competitive bidding. Okay, so that's quite a letter from the Senior VP of Marketing for Smith & Wesson. And as marketing people are known to do, there's a little bit of spin going on there instead of just factual evidence. So it's interesting that that letter is then followed up with a response from the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of Utah, and its response is back to the Senior Vice President of Marketing for Smith & Wesson. And it reads, I'm in the receipt of a September 11th correspondence requesting that we can reconsider our purchase of the Heckler and Koch P7M8 semi-automatic pistols. I reviewed your letter and concerns with care and conferred with the Utah Highway Patrol Administration regarding those concerns, and I would by this correspondence inform you that we intend to go forward with our purchase of the Heckler and Koch weapons. This purchase was previously cleared through the purchasing agencies of the state of Utah, and they have approved our sole source request. Previous to our discussion to purchase the H&K weapons, we made extensive studies regarding the weapons, its performance and experience by other agencies. Our department's firearms instructors have made contact on several occasions with the New Jersey State Police, and since receiving your letter, we made additional contact to verify the claims set forth in your letter to me. Contact was made with, I'll leave his name out, the officer in charge of basic and advanced handgun training. He informed us that they have had not more than 4 self-inflicted wounds from the use of the P7, nor any other person has been injured due to the accidental discharge. He said he has no knowledge of a lieutenant shooting himself in the hand either. We have also contacted the Washington, D.C. Capitol Police Department and spoke there with their operational commanding officer for containment and emergency response team. He indicated to us that they did in fact have a sergeant killed in a tactical training exercise and indeed was shot with an officer carrying a P7, but he stressed repeatedly, however, that the accident was shooter error and could have occurred with any weapon. The squeeze cock mechanism had nothing whatsoever to do with the incident, and he also indicated that his team still uses the P7 and will be ordering more in the near future. Contact was made with NRA in Washington, D.C., and we were informed by an individual that the NRA would have no independent facts regarding the alleged firearms incidents, but would simply compile and collect that information from newspapers. Last week, our firearms instructor attempted to call you, but because you were out, a representative from the company called back, and our instructor was informed that if he wanted a real scoop on the lieutenant that had shot himself in the hand, he should contact the director of the police academy where the incident took place. We were told to contact that individual at the Burlington Police Academy. He was contacted last Thursday afternoon only to indicate that such an incident had not taken place at his academy, and he had no idea why anyone would say it would. In short, I have some great concern of the factual accuracy of the information about the H&K weapons you have provided. We have found them to be state-of-the-art and readily accepted by our personnel. We are confident with the proper training, as must be the case with all semi-automatic weapons, we can avoid accidental discharges and injuries that could be contributed to the unique squeeze cocking mechanism. It is our opinion that this unique cocking system offers a host of advantages not available in the competing 9mm semi-automatic weapons. All of this is not to say that we do not have the highest regard for Smith & Wesson Company and its products. We do, however, feel that H&K weapons suits our needs and are superior to the other 9mm semi-automatics on the marketplace. Thank you for taking the time to write me and expressing your concerns. So, easily rebutted basically everything that the marketing VP for Smith & Wesson provided, but it follows on with one more letter, which is just great. November 18th, 1986. This one is from the State of New Jersey Department of Law and Public Safety Division of the State Police, and it is addressed to the President of Smith & Wesson. And it reads, I have at hand a copy of a letter which I am informed is a communication from Smith & Wesson's Senior Vice President of Marketing to the Commissioner of Public Safety of the State of Utah. The Commissioner had contacted my office regarding the material in the Smith & Wesson letter, and we have provided the state of Utah with the information necessary to properly evaluate their intent to acquire new firearms inventory for their public safety officers. I personally resent the misrepresentations contained in your letter to Utah and will address my remarks only to the portion of the letter which concerns the New Jersey State Police. None of the assertions in your Vice President's letter regarding my division are truthful, and in my opinion, they represent a clear effort to undermine the ability of an administrator seeking to evaluate an arms acquisition. I am well aware of the competitive nature of the handgun business and understand that competition among vendors can sometimes become intense, but this free market competition, however, does not lend itself to misrepresentation. Should any responsible representative of your company have a need for information relating to our acquisition and introduction into the inventory of the Heckler and Koch weapons, I shall be more than pleased to provide our statistics freely. As a longtime customer of Smith & Wesson, I have come to rely upon the spirit of mutual respect and trust which has always characterized our relationship. I am therefore confident that this letter was not sanctioned by our company, and I invite your comments in regard and hope that we may continue a relationship as we have valued in the past. So, I like that. I think it's pretty cool. And I know enough guys who have been in the sales products for a firearms company to understand that yes, it can be really challenging as you try and represent your similar weapon against a bunch of others, and trust me, I like to jab at other companies as much as the next guy, but completely false accusations, that's just out of control. So anyway, there you go. I hope you enjoyed that little tangent we took down. But back to the New Jersey State Police adoption of their P7M8. All the accounts that I've been able to find from the actual troopers who used them were really positive. They praised the pistol in the same reasons that I do, and the same reasons that I continue to carry P7M8 as my primary EDC and have so for 23 years, and most likely will do for another 23 years. So happy were they with these pistols that, as so many other law enforcement organizations over the years, continue to be kind of a revolving door of newer semi-automatic weapons from different companies being acquired and put into service. The New Jersey State Police continue to use the P7M8 all the way through the 80s, from its initial adoption in May of 1983, and all the way through the 90s, all the way until 2000. That long period of time, 17 years with the same weapon, really speaks volumes to what they thought about the quality of that weapon in its intended role as a police sidearm. But of course, as it always is, there comes a time where a decision has to be made to move on to a newer product, and that transition occurs. And unfortunately, just like it had at the beginning of this video, where the P7M8 was adopted, in the end, it took a tragic incident to jumpstart a new adoption process for a new pistol. And unfortunately, that incident occurred on October 24th of 1997, when Trooper Scott Gonzalez was engaged in a high-speed pursuit of an armed suspect. That chase concluded when the suspect turned down a dead-end street, and Officer Gonzalez, Trooper Gonzalez, I should say, blocked his car in to prevent the suspect's escape. Unfortunately, what happened next is really kind of a perfect storm of bad instances that all ended up proving fatal for Trooper Gonzalez. First of all, the suspect, once he found himself cornered, rammed Trooper Gonzalez's cruiser with his truck, and the impact was so significant that not only did it deploy the airbag, initially disorienting Trooper Gonzalez, but it actually jammed the car doors on either side to prevent him from exiting the vehicle. So he's now, at that case, trapped inside his cruiser. Next, he exited his truck and began maneuvering towards the cruiser, firing a shotgun at Trooper Gonzalez while he's stuck in his car. Now, Trooper Gonzalez presented his P7M8 and fired at the suspect. And there's differing reports that I've seen. One report says he fired 3 rounds, another report says he fired 7 rounds. But regardless, at some point during that firing, his weapon malfunctioned. And none of those rounds were able to make contact with the suspect as he was approaching the vehicle. Trooper Gonzalez then attempted to release the Benelli M1 entry shotgun that was mounted in a rack in the vehicle to bring that into the fight. But again, it was not able to be released from the rack that secured it. So he went back to his P7M8, was able to to clear that malfunction, reload a magazine, but before he was able to bring the gun back into action, he was fatally shot by the suspect. So the cause of the malfunction was, at least from what I can see and from what I've talked to troopers, it was never clearly defined. We can assume, as I've had from some people said, that it was related to the gas piston cylinder system locking up. And we've seen that in the past. Obviously, I see that all the time on the workbench, where if the weapon is not properly maintained, specific to the gas piston system, and too much carbon accumulates in there, it can bind up the slide. There was another assertion that there was a failure of the firing pin and a compression spring inside the firing pin assembly that related to it. But regardless of the fact, the weapon failed, as all weapons can fail. And that's what led to the incident. Undoubtedly, the question really applies, as people would point that out. The P7M8 failed. All weapons can and will fail. And trust me, I've been teaching firearms courses long enough and been in military service long enough and been running this business long enough to see that happens regardless of the manufacturer and the specific type of weapon. And the longer that weapon is in service and the longer that it is not maintained properly, the more likely those things will happen. And with a gun that's been in service for 17 years, who knows how many times it was rebuilt properly, those things can happen. So it made perfect sense that a reaction to that would be, hey, we need to go out and find another weapon system. And what the New Jersey State Police did was quickly test and decide that they wanted to move on to the Smith & Wesson SW99, which was a new pistol to the market at the time. Unfortunately, as we've seen with lots of other introductions of pistols, the weapon that's actually brought to the initial testing performs really well, but when the weapons are actually delivered, it's somewhat different. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes there can be a decision made at the company level to make some sort of change from that initial weapon to what's actually delivered. Maybe it's a cost savings technique, to apply a different finish to a weapon that leads to corrosion issues, or to not heat treat something that relates to something that then fails, or it just may be a lack of quality control. But in this instance, that initial transition training course they had for these weapons found immediate and massive failures in the ability to eject and extract those cartridges, which again led back to the same problem they've had with so many other semi-automatic weapons, a weak extractor. They also found several stress fractures in the slides due to the recoil impulses. They addressed that with Smith & Wesson, and though Smith & Wesson said they were going to fix it, New Jersey State Police said, nope, we're moving on. And they canceled that contract and then immediately reissued the P7M8s to the officers who had just turned them in, and reached out to H&K to order a complete complement of new P7M8s, an order of 3,000 of them. Now at this time in 2000, the P7M8 was still in production, and H&K was able to initially provide 400 weapons to the state police, and those weapons were cycled out with the most well-worn P7M8s in their inventory. But unfortunately, H&K came back very soon after and said, hey, we're just not going to be able to complete the rest of this contract. And that was due to the fact that really the P7M8 at that point in time had become just a civilian commercial purchase weapon. H&K had moved on from it from a sales perspective for law enforcement simply due to the price. At that point, the cost of the P7M8 was really almost 3 times the cost of the USP, which was their new flagship model. And at that point, they were also already involved in the development of the P2000, which would succeed it. And their production capacity within HK Germany was already full, deploying other new weapons. So to be able to stop a production line, retool to produce the remaining weapons just wasn't something that they were capable of doing that time. So that left the state police now again in another bind. What do we do? So they went out and then quickly selected the 6-hour P228 and purchased that to replace the P7M8 in service. That came in the fall of 2000 with an order of 3,200 pistols. Those pistols went on to service until several years later, when those as well were found to need to be replaced. They didn't wait anywhere near 17 years at that point. And a selection then came to look at what they would replace it with. They looked at Glocks, and there was one half of the camp that was focused on, hey, we should switch to Glocks. The other half was pretty happy with the P228s, and instead they selected the P229R Enhanced Elite to be their new service pistol. But unfortunately, it's just bad luck for the New Jersey State Police, I guess. That it ended up being a disaster on 2 fronts. First, because of the difference in the rear beaver tail on the P229R Enhanced Elite, it would not fit in their duty holsters like the P228 had. And they had to go back to Safari Land and rapidly have them make a change to a new holster design that would incorporate that weapon. So that delayed its initial issue to the officers. And then second, they once again saw considerable amounts of failures in manufacturing and reliability of the weapons. So much so that in 2017, the New Jersey State Police actually sued 6 Hour over the cost of the contract, stating that the pistols were virtually inoperable. So what happened? A settlement was reached and a new pistol was once again chosen. This time they went with the Glock Gen 4, and at the time of this release, that's what they're still using. So anyway, that wraps up this video. I hope that even though it may have been kind of dry and just me kind of reading to you, that if you're a fan of the P7 series or the history of these weapons, that you found that interesting, kind of a fireside chat, as you might say, for those. Maybe you're just a diehard P7 fan to stick around for. But regardless, I'm glad you did. As always, I'm incredibly humbled to be able to share this experience and knowledge with you guys and really the H&K community. And as always, if you've got H&K service and support needs, or you're looking for unique training opportunities, give me a shout. That's what I'm here for, guys. Take care.